Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Well, today, as previously stated in my last video, I am going to be doing a Knife Show Sunday video on the Case M3 field knife. I'm going to go over the knife, go over some of the history of the knife. I'm not going to go a lot into the variations of it, but we'll discuss some of the more important factors. Start off with, like I hinted in the other video, the M3 has the distinction of being the shortest produced military knife there's been. Production on this knife started in March of 1943 and ended in August of 1944. This knife was actually introduced as a prototype in December of 1942 to, as it puts it, the Smaller War Plants Corporation Board to be evaluated and tested against none other than the USMC's K-bar. Now, the whole purpose of this was to replace the Mark I trench knife. Everyone knows what that is. That is the dagger style trench knife from World War I that has usually the brass handle with the built-in knuckles into it. And the reason they wanted to replace that knife, as it says in my research that I've done, was primarily to conserve strategic metal resources. Pretty much they didn't want to use all of the brass for the handle and all of that. So the two designs were the M3 and the K-bar. Overall, the M3 ended up beating the K-bar out, not because it was a better knife, but as anyone who's ever been in the military or dealt with the government, it was approved because of its cheaper production cost than the K-bar and ease of producing, it said. Let me see if I can find the exact words it used here. There it is. While the specified priority steel supplies for both knives were available, the M3's lower production cost compared to that of the K-bar convinced the SWPC Board of Directors to approve the M3 for production. Now, one of the drawbacks of this knife compared to the K-bar is the K-bar was designed as a close combat fighting knife and a utility knife. The M3, according to the U.S. Catalog of Standard Ordnance Items in 1943, describes the M3 trench knife as being developed to fill the need in modern warfare for hand-to-hand fighting. While designated for issue to soldiers not armed with a bayonet, it is especially designed for such shock units as parachute troops and rangers. So this was designed as a fighting knife, not as a utility knife. The blade on it is 6 3/4 inches long. As you can tell, it's very thin. Not real thick bar stock out of it. Let's see what I've got here we can compare it to. Here it is compared to a SE3. So it's probably about 1/8 of an inch thick, close to it. The handle is designed of stacked washers. This one, if you look real close at it, you can see the individual washers. Later on, these, according to the research, says the grooved handle was later simplified by forming the grip of stacked leather washers that were shaped by turning them on a lathe. Then they were polished and lacquered. It says the steel crossguard has an angle in it, and it says that angular bend is to facilitate a thumb rest, just like that. Now, there were 3 production runs of this knife during its short lifespan. The first production run, when you see them on the blade, it'll say USM3, then whatever company. There were 9 of them that produced these, and we'll get into that in a minute. And then it would have the date, 1943 or 1944 on it. That was the first production run. The second production run would say US M3 and then have the maker. There wouldn't be a date on it. And then the very last production run, which is what this one is, there would be nothing on the blade on either side, but it would be stamped on the crossguard. And this one says US M3 and then case as the manufacturer. I don't know why the different stampings come to be. I couldn't find anything on that as to an explanation of why they changed the stamping of the blade or the crossguard. But originally, when these were first introduced into service, they were issued to Rangers, Airborne, and so forth first. And then as time passed and they became more and more available, they were then issued to Army Air Corps servicemen and crewmen, and then to soldiers that were not issued a bayonet. Pretty much what that means is, if you were a soldier and you carried anything other than an M1 Garand, then you got issued one of these. Thompson, M3 grease gun, M1 carbine, any of those weapons, then you were issued an M3 trench knife. These things, once they stopped producing them in 44, they didn't take them out of service. These knives were still issued for the rest of World War II. They were issued in Korea, and they were issued in Vietnam before finally being pulled out of service. It says here they were in service from 43 to 50. So they were actually in, I guess you'd say, inventory to be signed out or issued out to soldiers. There are still some of these that were floating around in Vietnam. You'll find some every once in a while that were used in Vietnam that the sheath was painted black. The handles, like these, were darker instead of lighter. I've seen different ways of doing that. One way, they would soak them in used motor oil, and that would cause the leather to turn black. In the later years, when they were issued the M8s and the M8A1 sheaths, they were painted. And the reason they were painted was because they were made out of fiberglass. Now, I've got a copy of a replica of an M6 sheath, which was the original sheath issued with this knife. And then I've got a US M8. I don't have an M8A1, but we'll talk about the difference on that here in just a second. I mentioned a minute ago that there were 9 companies that produced these knives. Altogether, there were about 2.5 million of these things made. And the numbers on them is pretty interesting. Out of the 9 companies that produced these, they produced a total of 2,590,247 M3s. Imperial Knife Company produced 854,000. Utica produced 656,000. Camulus or Camillus, whichever way you want to pronounce it, produced 402,000. Case produced 300,000. Kinfolk produced 135,000. Powell Blade and Tool Company produced 121,000. Ariel Cutlery Company produced 51,000. Robeson, I guess, Robeson produced 36,000, and H. Boker and Sons produced 31,000. So the case was kind of right there in the middle as far as numbers being produced. They originally came in an M6. If you've watched Band of Brothers, you will see this sheath in it a lot. Mainly fastened to the leg of the soldier opposite their strong side. And you'll have them strapped, tied, everything to their leg. Now, if you notice, it's got a steel plate here and one on the back side. The reason for that is when the knife is inserted, to keep it from accidentally poking through the sheath and injuring the user. It has the hook at the top for a World War II style, pistol belt that can be worked in and hooked that way. It also has a small belt loop. It has a little metal piece right there. And what that does, one, is it rides against the sheath, or against the knife blade when you put it in. But the other thing is it holds the top of the sheath open. I'm assuming to make it easier to get the knife in it when you have to put the knife back in the sheath. The USM8 is what come with this knife. Notice it doesn't have the hook at the top to hook into a web belt. Every once in a while you'll find one of these where they put the hook in themselves and then sewed across the top to fasten it in place. These sheaths are made out of fiberglass, and the M8 had one real bad problem, and you see it right there. Setting down, the ends of these would break off, and then once the end of them would break off, they would do that. They would split open up the side. The M8A1 is identical to this with one exception. It has a metal cap that comes up about that far over the tip of the sheath to prevent that problem. Now, this blade style, if you look at it real close and then start looking at a lot of Vietnam era M16 bayonets, you will notice the blade design is the same. There were many, many, many variations of this knife. There was the M4, same knife, different crossguard, made as a bayonet for the M1 carbine. There was the M5, which is made to fit an M1 Grand. The M6 that fit the M14 rifle, and then the M7 that fit the M16. I cannot find anything on what kind of steel they used in this knife. I'm assuming it's 1095. That was pretty common at the time. Overall length is 11 3/4 inches. The blade, like I said, is 6 3/4 inches. You will see a lot of these at reenactments. I think the most common reproduction out there now is made by Boker. They actually still have one of these in their catalog that you can order under their, I think it's Boker Plus line. As far as the sheaths, the M8A1 was issued with these all the way up through the M16 Vietnam era. So those are still pretty readily available. You can still find the original M6s, but you're going to pay for them. And original, almost all of them, right below that thing right there, would have stamped in it the manufacturer that made the sheath. That's one of the things to look for when looking for an original. The M8s, you can still find them, but the problem with them is a lot of times they'll be in this shape. But I haven't decided what I'm going to do with this knife yet. I don't know if I'm just going to leave it as is, if I'm going to resharpen it and try to bring it back. And still looking at this, I did find out that this washer here, whenever it was put on, they did not take the pommel off of it. What they did is they cut a leather washer to fit and then split that washer, you can see the line in it, and then slid it up on there and glued it in. So I haven't decided if I'm going to try to contact Case and get them to maybe try to redo the handle for me. I'm not sure yet. Part of me wants to leave it the way it is. Part of me wants to restore it. So I don't know. But I hope you found all of this interesting. I know it's a lot to be throwing out over a knife that's, what, almost 80 years old. So some people find it interesting. I got a lot of this information from my buddy over at E Squad 540, George Jones. He is a big World War II reenactor, and on his channel he's got several videos that he has shot when he is doing some of the reenactment. Very interesting to watch. Some of them are incredible, let's put it that way. Go over, check his channel out. If you haven't done so from the previous video, go check out Gentry Gallery. He has a lot of videos on military surplus, and he's a big collector of military air weapons, knives, and different equipment. So go over and check him out as well. Well, like I said, I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's a lot, but bear with me. I'll get you some more up here soon. Like, share, subscribe. I'll see y'all later.